The vibration did not start in my ears. It started in the marrow of my bones, a low rhythmic thrum that matched the grinding of the coolant pumps in Sector 44. For a dredger like me, noise was usually an enemy. It meant a gasket was about to blow, or a ventilation shaft was clogged with the toxic soot we spent 12 hours a day scraping. But this was different. This was clean. I wiped a smear of hydraulic grease across my forehead, leaving a dark streak on my gray skin. Above me, the massive view plates of the lower decks flickered to life. It was a rare event. The High Magistrate did not broadcast to the dredge unless the ring was about to undergo a major gravitational shift, or more likely if there was a quota increase. "Look at that, Nix," Kyle whispered, leaning on his hydro wrench. He was a broad-shouldered man, his lungs wheezing from 20 years of breathing recirculated dust. "The big dogs look like they've seen a ghost." On the screen, the Zenith Conclave Chamber was a sea of shimmering silk and polished chrome. The delegates of the Convergence stood in stunned silence. In the center of the hall stood a figure that seemed to defy the very laws of optics. She was tall, draped in fabrics that flowed like liquid starlight, shifting between shades of deep indigo and blinding silver. Her face was obscured by a veil of void glass, etched with moving symbols that hurt my eyes if I stared too long. She was an Aeon, a myth made of flesh and light. Magistrate Varric stepped forward, his ornate synaptic translator glinting on his temple. "On behalf of the 7 systems, we welcome the envoy of Oros," he announced. His voice was oily, the tone of a man trying to sell a dying star. "We are honored by your return after 10,000 years. The envoy did not move. Then she spoke. The sound tore through the conclave's audio systems. It wasn't speech. It was a harmonic collision, the sound of a cello being played inside a cathedral made of ice, layered with the mathematical precision of a pulsar's beat. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. And then the chaos began. On the screen, the magistrate's translator chip emitted a sharp blue spark. He gasped, clutching his head as a thin trail of smoke curled from his temple. Around the room, delegates staggered. Some ripped their earpieces out as the devices hissed and died. The sophisticated linguistic engines of the Convergence, capable of processing 4 million dialects in real time, had just met something they couldn't digest. "Unknown," a voice crackled over the broadcast. Scholar Elara Vance, the ring's lead xenolinguist. Her holographic displays were a mess of red error codes. "There is no reference point. The syntax is nonlinear. It's like she's speaking in 4 dimensions at once. We've got nothing, Magistrate. The systems are flatlined." I stood frozen in the grime of Sector 44. The sound was still echoing in my head, but it didn't hurt. It felt familiar, like a ghost of a memory I never had. The envoy spoke again. Her gestures were fluid, her hands tracing patterns in the air that seemed to leave faint trails of light. She sounded desperate. There was a mourning quality to the resonance now, a deep, aching sorrow that made my chest tighten. "She's crying," I whispered. Cal looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Crying? It sounds like a power grid failure, kid. My ears are ringing like a church bell." "No, listen to the cadence," I insisted, my heart hammering against my ribs. The low frequency at the end of the phrase. It's a plea. She's saying the fires are going out. The broadcast cut to static as the security teams rushed the floor. I stood there in the dark. The smell of burnt ozone and recycled air thickened my throat. My grandmother used to hum a tune when the station lights went dark during the Great Blackout. She called it the Song of the Loom. I had always thought it was just gibberish, a nonsense lullaby passed down through generations of soot-stained laborers. But as the envoy's voice lingered in my mind, I realized the Song of the Loom wasn't gibberish. It was a fragment, a shard of the very language that had just shattered the most expensive technology in the galaxy. "Nix, you okay?" "You look like you've seen a ghost," Kyle said, reaching out to steady me. "I have to go," I said, dropping my scraper. "Go where?" "Shift isn't over for another 4 hours. You bug out now and the overseers will dock your credits for a month." "Let them," I shouted back, already running toward the lift shafts. "They're looking for a translator, Kale, and they're looking in the wrong places." I didn't know how I would get past the security perimeters. I didn't know if I was even right. But for the first time in my life, The pipes weren't just vibrating. They were calling. The climb from the dredge to the spire was not just a journey of 3 kilometers. It was a journey through the layers of human arrogance. As the lift climbed, the air grew sweeter. The light shifted from the harsh orange of sodium lamps to the soft, artificial glow of simulated sunlight. And the people. The people grew taller and cleaner, their skin untouched by the gray pallor of the soot. I was a stain on their perfection. My coveralls were stiff with oil, and my boots left faint, dark prints on the translucent flooring of the upper transit hub. 2 enforcers intercepted me before I even stepped off the platform. Their armor was white and gold, polished to a mirror finish. "Identify yourself, Dredger," the one on the left barked. His hand rested on a shock baton. "Sector 44 is restricted. You're about 3 levels too high for your own good." "I need to speak to Magistrate Varric," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. My accent was thick, the rough, clipped tongue of the lower decks. "About the envoy." The 2 guards exchanged a look of pure derision. "The envoy? You hear that, Harl? The scraphead wants to talk to the magistrate about the most important diplomatic event of the millennium." "Beat it, girl," the guard named Harl said, stepping forward, "before we charge you with trespassing and send you to the reclamation vats." "The language!" I shouted, desperation flaring in my gut. "You can't translate it because your machines are looking for logic. But it's not logic, it's resonance. My grandmother taught me the frequencies. Vectal Shunra." I spoke the words, or tried to. The phonemes were difficult, requiring a specific tension in the throat that most obsidian laborers had from years of yelling over heavy machinery. The effect was instantaneous. The air around us seemed to hum. A nearby decorative fountain rippled, the water forming a brief, perfect geometric pattern before collapsing. The enforcers froze, their eyes widening. "What did you just do?" Harl whispered, his hand trembling on his baton. "I told the water to remember its shape," I said, though I hadn't known that was what I was saying until the words left my lips. Before they could decide whether to arrest me or flee, a voice echoed through the hub. "Enough!" Scholar Elara Vance stepped out from behind a pillar. She looked exhausted, her hair disheveled, her eyes bloodshot behind her data lens. She stared at me, then at the lingering ripples in the fountain. "Bring her," Vance ordered the guards. Her voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. "Now!" The conclave chamber was even more imposing in person. The scale of it made me feel like an insect. The envoy, Thalassa, was still standing in the center, a silent statue of light. Magistrate Varric was huddled with a group of advisors, their voices a frantic murmur. "Magistrate," Vance called out as we entered. "I found something." Varric turned, his face reddening when he saw me. "A dredger? Vance, have you lost your mind? We are on the brink of a total diplomatic collapse, and you bring a Soot-Eater into the inner sanctum?" "She can speak it," Vance said simply. The room went silent. 100 pairs of eyes belonging to the most powerful beings in the 7 systems settled on me. I felt the weight of their judgment, their instinctive disgust at my stained clothes and my common face. "Impossible," Delegate Xylos of the Obsidian Spire stepped forward. He was of my own race, but his skin had been polished with expensive oils, and he wore the robes of a high representative. He looked at me with more contempt than anyone else. "The Obsidian were created for labor. Our linguistic capacity is limited to basic technical directives. To suggest this creature knows the language of the Aeon is an insult to our history." "I don't care about your history, Xylos," I spat, my temper finally snapping. "I care about the noise in the pipes. I care about the songs my father sang while he was dying in a crawl space because your high and mighties wouldn't pay for a proper respirator." I turned away from the magistrate and looked at Thalassa. Up close, the envoy was breathtaking. I could see the way her veil reacted to my presence, the symbols shifting into patterns that felt like a warm hand on my shoulder. "She isn't here to negotiate trade routes," I said to the room. "She isn't here to give you technology." "Then why is she here?" Varric demanded. I looked at Thalassa. The resonance was there again, a low vibration in the air. I closed my eyes and reached for the memory of my grandmother's voice, for the sounds that shouldn't have mattered, but were the only things I truly owned. I spoke. It was clumsy. My accent was jagged, like a saw blade against silk, but the words had weight. We are the children of the scattered dust. We remember the loom. Thalassa flinched. It was the first movement she had made in hours. She raised her hands and the void glass of her veil cleared. Her eyes were like deep pools of liquid obsidian, reflecting 1,000 stars. She spoke back. The sound was a tidal wave of emotion. Magistrate Varric gripped the table. Translate. What is she saying? I felt a tear track through the soot on my cheek. She says their son, Oros, has breathed its last. She says 9 billion souls are drifting in the dark, waiting for a door to open. I paused, the next words catching in my throat. And she says she is surprised that the only one who remembers the key is the one we tried so hard to make forget. The chamber erupted in noise. Arguments, denials, frantic calculations of resources. 9 billion refugees. It was an impossibility. A death sentence for the ring's economy. But Thalassa wasn't looking at the magistrate. She was looking at me. She stepped forward, her starlight robes brushing the floor, and touched her hand to her heart. You have kept the words safe, she said in a whisper that didn't need a translator. It was the common tongue of the convergence, but spoken with a grace that made it sound like poetry. Why? I looked at my scarred, grease-stained hands. I thought of the generations of Thalas who had lived and died in the dredge, clutching onto useless songs and nonsense stories, while the rest of the galaxy moved on to bigger and better things. Because, I said, my voice echoing in the sudden silence of the conclave, sometimes when you have nothing else, the past is the only thing that keeps you from becoming a ghost. Magistrate Varric stepped forward. His eyes narrowed. This changes nothing. We cannot house 9 billion people. The logistics alone would sink us. You don't understand, Scholar Vance said, looking at her datapad with a look of dawning horror. She isn't asking for the ring. She's asking for the forge. The forge, the abandoned core of the Zenith Ring, a space large enough to house a civilization, but one that had been locked for 5,000 years because no one could find the frequency to stabilize its artificial sun. I can open it, I said. Varric laughed, a cold, dry sound. You? A girl from the pipes? The language isn't just speech, Magistrate, I said, stepping closer to Thalassa. It's a set of instructions. It's the source code for the ring itself. My people weren't brought here to be your slaves. We were brought here to be the keepers. And you were so busy making us work, you forgot what we were working for. I looked at the envoy. She nodded once. The test has begun, Thalassa said to the room, her voice cold and clear. Not for her, for you. As the high-ranking officials began to panic, I realized that my life as a dredger was over. But as I looked at the ancient woman of light, I felt a strange sense of peace. The vibration in my bones had finally found its rhythm. The elevator ride down to the threshold of the forge felt like a descent into the belly of a sleeping god. We were no longer in the polished, air-conditioned heights of the spire, nor were we in the familiar, grease-choked corridors of the dredge. We were in the interstitial spaces, the places where the station's bones were exposed. Here the walls were made of a dull, pulsing alloy that felt warm to the touch, and the air carried a scent I couldn't place, something like rain hitting hot metal. High Magistrate Varric was sweating. He had swapped his ceremonial silks for a tactical environmental suit, but he still looked like a man who had accidentally stepped into a cage with a predator. Behind him, a squad of 6 enforcers kept their rifles leveled at the shadows, their eyes darting nervously. They didn't like being this far from the grid. To them, the silence was a threat. To me, it was a conversation I was finally beginning to understand. How much further, Nix? Alara Vance asked. She was the only one who seemed more curious than terrified. She was recording everything on a handheld scanner, her fingers flying across the holographic interface. We are almost at the junction of the 3 veins, I said, my voice sounding strange in the acoustic dampening of the tunnel. That is what my father called it. The maps say it is Sector 001, but in the old stories, it is the Heart's Gate. This is madness, Delegate Xylos hissed. He was trailing at the back of the group, looking at the ancient walls with a mixture of loathing and fear. We are following a common laborer into the most volatile section of the ring, based on a lullaby, and the word of an alien we can't even talk to. Varric, we should turn back. If the forge destabilizes, it will rip the entire ring apart. Varric stopped and turned to look at the high-ranking obsidian. And if we don't open it, Xylos, we have 9 billion Aeons sitting on our doorstep with nowhere to go. If we turn them away, we look like monsters. If we let them stay in the hubs, we starve within a month. This laborer is the only one who hasn't had her brain fried by that invoice speech. We move forward. Xylos looked like he wanted to spit, but he held his tongue. He didn't want to get dusted in the dark. And without the enforcers, he was just a man in a very expensive suit. "Don't sweat it, Xylos," I muttered as I passed him. "The walls haven't started screaming yet. That's usually a good sign." He glared at me. "Watch your tone, Dredger. You might be the flavor of the month, but once this is over, you're going right back to the soot." "Maybe," I said, a cold smile touching my lips. "But I'll be the one who knows how to lock the door behind me." We reached a massive circular portal, at least 50 meters in diameter. It wasn't made of the same metal as the rest of the station. It looked like obsidian, real obsidian, but it was shot through with veins of glowing blue light that pulsed in a slow, steady rhythm. There were no keypads, no biometric scanners, no visible way to open it. "Our engineers have spent centuries trying to bypass this seal," Varric said, stepping up to the portal. He looked small against the vastness of the gate. "We've tried thermal drills, sonic pulses, even localized gravity shears. Nothing even leaves a scratch. It's like it doesn't exist in our physical reality." I stepped forward, my boots crunching on the ancient dust. I could feel the resonance now, a powerful hum that made the hair on my arms stand up. It wasn't just sound. It was a physical pressure, a weight in the air that seemed to push against my chest. "It's not a door," I said softly, reaching out to touch the dark surface. "It's a mirror." "A mirror?" Vance asked, stepping closer. "Nix, be careful. The energy readings near that surface are off the charts." "It's okay," I said, and I meant it. The fear that had been my constant companion since leaving the dredge had evaporated. In its place was a strange, ancestral calm. "It's waiting for a password that isn't made of numbers." I looked back at Thalassa. The envoy had been following us in silence, her starlight robes casting long, shifting shadows against the walls. She met my gaze, and for a moment, I felt a flash of her grief. The weight of 9 billion lives hanging by a single, fraying thread. She didn't speak, but her posture was a plea. I turned back to the gate. I didn't think about what to say. I didn't try to remember the lyrics of the lullabies. I just let the vibration in my bones guide my throat. I opened my mouth and let out a sound that felt like it was tearing a path through my soul. "Ren Kashai, Loma Tavor. The stars have cooled. The loom is heavy. Open the hearth for the wayfarers of Oros." The sound didn't echo. It was absorbed by the door, the blue veins suddenly flaring into a blinding, white brilliance. The ground beneath us groaned, a deep, tectonic shift that sent the enforcers scrambling for balance. "Stay sharp!" the squad leader yelled, his rifle whining as it powered up. "Something's moving!" The circular portal didn't slide open. It dissolved. The dark material turned into a fine black mist that swirled in the air before being sucked into the walls. As the mist cleared, a blast of air hit us, air that smelled of ozone, crushed clover, and ancient, stagnant warmth. We stood at the edge of a vast internal hollow. It was impossible to see the other side. Thousands of lights began to flicker to life in the distance, tiny sparks of amber and gold that stretched on for kilometers. Below us, a landscape of tiered platforms and hanging gardens descended into a soft, glowing mist. "By the seven," Varric whispered, his pragmatism finally failing him. "It's a world, an entire world inside the ring." "The forge," I said, stepping onto the first platform. "It wasn't a factory. It was a lifeboat." Thalassa walked past the magistrate, her movements light and reverent. She stood at the edge of the overlook, her robes billowing in the sudden draft. She let out a long, melodic breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. "This will suffice," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber without the aid of any technology. "The children of Oros will find peace here." "Now hold on a minute," Varric said, finding his voice again. He stepped forward, his eyes already darting around the chamber, calculating the value of the technology he was seeing. This is convergence territory. We have protocols for resettlement. We need to conduct surveys, assess the power requirements, establish a governance framework. The framework is already established, Magistrate, I interrupted. I was looking at a nearby console, a simple plinth of dark stone that had risen from the floor. As I approached it, symbols appeared on its surface. Not the symbols of the convergence, but the symbols of my grandmother's stories. The forge belongs to the keepers, and the keepers have decided to honor the covenant. The keepers? Xylos scoffed, stepping into the chamber. You mean the Soot-Eaters from 44? Don't get ahead of yourself, girl. You opened a door. That doesn't make you a queen. It makes me the one who knows how to turn the air off, Xylos, I said, not looking at him. My fingers danced over the stone surface, guided by an instinct that felt older than the station itself. The forge is biolinked. It only responds to the resonance of the obsidian. If you try to take it by force, it will simply seal itself again. And this time, I won't be here to sing it open. Varric looked at the enforcers, then at me, then at the vast, shimmering world laid out before us. He was a smart man, and he knew when he had been outplayed. Vance, he said, turning to the scholar, begin the preliminary scans. I want to know exactly what we're dealing with here. He looked at me, his expression unreadable. And you, Nyx? It seems we have a lot to talk about. But let's get one thing straight. This isn't just a rescue mission anymore. This is a turning point for the entire galaxy. Don't think for a second that the other member worlds will just let you hand this over to a bunch of refugees without a fight. Let them come, I said, feeling the power of the forge pulsing through the soles of my boots. They've spent 10,000 years forgetting where they came from. It's time they learned what happens when the Foundation decides it's had enough. But as I looked out at the beauty of the forge, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I had opened the door, yes, but I could feel the station waking up. And it wasn't just a lifeboat, it was a weapon. And I was the only one who could hear it starting to hum. The first 72 hours inside the forge were a blur of sensory overload and bureaucratic nightmares. While Thalassa's people, the first wave of them at least, began to filter through the Heart's Gate, the Convergence was busy trying to stake its claim. They sent in teams of scientists, engineers, and legal vultures, all of them eager to dissect the miracle I had uncovered. I sat on a stone bench in the third tier of the Hanging Gardens, watching a group of technicians in sterile white suits fumble with a power relay. They were using laser scals and diagnostic probes, trying to force the station to give up its secrets. They're going to break it if they keep that up, I muttered. They're certainly trying, Alara Vance said, sitting down beside me. She looked like she hadn't slept since we entered the forge. Her eyes were sunken, and she was nursing a cup of synthetic caffeine that smelled like burnt rubber. The High Magistrate is breathing down my neck every 20 minutes, demanding to know why we can't bypass the obsidian biolocks. I told him it's like trying to translate a poem into a spreadsheet. The meaning just doesn't transfer. He doesn't want meaning, I said. He wants the keys to the kingdom. True enough, Vance sighed. She looked at me, her gaze lingering on the gray, soot-stained skin of my arms. Nyx, I ran some preliminary genetic scans on the samples the medbay took from you when you arrived at the Spire. I didn't tell Varric, not yet. I stiffened. And? What did you find? That I'm just another biological fluke? Far from it, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The soot that covers the obsidian, it's not environmental, Nyx. It's not just carbon from the dredge. I looked down at my hands. I had scrubbed them until they bled in the high-deck showers. But the gray tint never faded. I had always hated it. It was the mark of my low birth, the stain that told the world I belonged in the dark. It's a bioreactive polymer, Vance continued, her excitement bubbling through her fatigue. It's a protective layer, yes, but it's also a conductor. It's designed to interface with the station's neural network. You aren't just laborers, Nyx. You are the station's peripheral nervous system. Every time a dredger scrapes a pipe or turns a valve, they are feeding data back into the core. You were never working for the Convergence. You were maintaining the god mind of the Zenith Ring. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. I thought of my father, his lungs scarred from years of maintaining the station, his body broken by the very machines he was designed to care for. He had died thinking he was a slave. never knowing he was a piece of the most sophisticated technology ever created. They didn't know, I whispered. For hundreds of generations, they just thought they were poor. The convergence erased the history, Vance said, her face hardening. They found the ring thousands of years ago, saw a race of people who could talk to the machines, and realized that if they kept you uneducated and desperate, they had a permanent workforce that could keep the station running without ever asking for a seat at the table. They turned your heritage into a cage. I felt a surge of rage so pure it made my vision blur. The prejudice wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. They hadn't just stolen our labor. They had stolen our identity. "Nix, you okay?" Vance asked, reaching out to touch my shoulder. "I'm fine," I said, though the words felt like ice. "I just realized that I'm not just opening a home for the Aeons. I'm starting a revolution." Before she could respond, my comlink chirped, a high, urgent tone that meant a priority one alert. It was Kale. "Nix, you need to get down to the transit hub, right now." His voice was frantic, competing with the sound of shouting and the rhythmic thud of heavy boots. "Kyle, what's going on? Are the SEALs holding?" "It's the enforcers. They're moving in on the first wave of refugees. They say there's a biological contamination risk, but they're just rounding people up. Xylos is with them, and he's got some kind of warrant from the High Conclave." "I'm on my way," I said, standing up so fast I knocked over Vance's coffee. "Vance, if you want to prove you're on the right side of history, you better find a way to block the station's internal security feeds. I don't want the Spire seeing what I'm about to do." "Nix, wait! What are you planning?" "I'm going to remind the station who it really belongs to," I said, and I was already running. I took the service chutes, sliding down hundreds of meters of vertical shafts that smelled of cold iron. I didn't need a map. I could feel the station's heartbeat now, a frantic, irregular thrumming that told me it was agitated. The forge was waking up, and it didn't like the intruders. I burst out into the main transit hub, a massive vaulted chamber where the first few thousand Aeon refugees were being processed. It was a scene of nightmare. The starlight-robed people of Oros were huddled together, their shimmering veils clouded with fear. Surrounding them was a perimeter of enforcers, their riot shields locked, their weapons humming. Delegate Xylos was standing on a raised platform, holding a glowing data slate. He looked down at the refugees with a sneer of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "By order of the Galactic Convergence," Xylos announced, his voice amplified by the hub's speakers, "all resettlement activities are suspended, pending a full security audit. These individuals will be moved to the holding cells in Sector 12 for medical evaluation. Any resistance will be met with lethal force." "You don't have the authority, Xylos," Kyle shouted from the crowd. He was standing in front of a group of Aeon children, his heavy hydro wrench held like a club. He looked small and ragged against the armored soldiers, but his eyes were blazing. "I have the authority of the High Magistrate, bottom feeder," Xylos spat. "And as a high representative of the Obsidian people, I am reclaiming this facility for the betterment of the Convergence. You're lucky I don't have you dusted for insubordination." "He's not the one who's insubordinate, Xylos," I said, stepping out of the shadows. The enforcers turned their weapons toward me, but I didn't stop walking. I could feel the soot on my skin beginning to glow, a faint, iridescent blue that matched the veins in the heart's gate. "Nix, get back!" Kyle yelled. "It's all right, Kale," I said, my voice calm, almost melodic. I looked up at Xylos, and I saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. He saw the glow. He knew what it meant. "You're a traitor to your race, girl," Xylos screamed, his voice cracking. "You'd hand our future to these ghosts? These relics from a dead sun?" "They aren't relics, Xylos. They're guests," I said. I stopped 10 meters from the enforcer line. "And you're trespassing." "Seize her," Xylos ordered. Two enforcers stepped forward, their shock batons extended. They were big men, trained for crowd control, confident in their superior armor and weaponry. They didn't see me as a threat. They saw a girl in dirty coveralls. I didn't fight them. I didn't have to. I simply reached out with my mind, tapping into the resonance that Vance had described. I felt the bioreactive polymer on my skin interface with the floor beneath my feet, sending a pulse of pure, raw data into the hub's control systems. "Protocol 09, defensive resonance. Identify intruders." The floor didn't just vibrate, it shrieked. A wave of sonic energy erupted from the tiles, a focused blast that bypassed the Enforcer's armor and hit their nervous systems directly. They didn't even have time to scream. They simply collapsed, their muscles seizing as the station's own frequency overrode their brainwaves. The rest of the squad froze, their rifles shaking. They had never seen the station fight back. "Drop the kit," I said, the words carrying a harmonic weight that made the air shimmer. "Now, or the next pulse will be permanent." One by one, the rifles hit the floor with a series of heavy thuds. The enforcers backed away, their faces pale behind their visors. They weren't looking at a dredger anymore. They were looking at the ghost in the machine. Xylos was trembling on his platform. You can't do this. The Convergence will send an army. They'll glass this entire sector." "They can try," I said, stepping onto the platform. I looked him in the eye, and for the first time, I felt pity for him. He had spent his whole life trying to scrub the gray away, trying to be a high hat in a world that would never truly accept him. He had traded his soul for a seat at a table that was about to be flipped. But the Forge isn't a tomb, Xylos. It's a heart, and hearts don't like being told how to beat. I reached out and took the data slate from his shaking hand. With a single thought, I crushed the internal processor, the glowing light flickering and dying. "Get out," I said. "Go back to the Spire and tell Varric that the Covenant is non-negotiable. The Aeons stay, the Keepers stay. And if he wants to talk, he can send Vance. She's the only one who knows how to listen." Xylos scrambled off the platform, nearly tripping over his own robes as he fled toward the elevators, followed by his disarmed and dazed enforcers. The hub fell into a sudden heavy silence. The refugees began to move again, their shimmering veils fluttering as they looked at me with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Cal stepped forward, his hydro wrench still in his hand. He looked at the blue glow on my skin, then at the fallen soldiers. "Well, kid," he said, a shaky grin touching his face. "I guess we aren't going back to Sector 44 for the next shift, are we?" "No, Cal," I said, the glow on my skin slowly fading as I disengaged from the network. "The shift just got a whole lot longer." Thalassa moved through the crowd, her presence like a calming breeze. She came to a stop in front of me and bowed low, a gesture that made the surrounding Aeons do the same. "You have defended those who could not defend themselves," she said, her voice resonant and sweet. "You have honored the ancient laws of hospitality. But know this, Keeper. The battle you have started will not be won with sound alone. The Convergence is built on the fear of the unknown, and you have just become the greatest unknown in their history." "I know," I said, looking up at the vast amber-lit ceiling of the Forge. "But for 10,000 years, we've been the foundation. It's about time we started being the walls, too." As the first wave of refugees began to settle into the tiers of the Forge, I felt a deep, aching fatigue settle into my bones. But beneath it was something else, a seed of hope that had been buried under layers of soot and shame for far too long. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were something new. But as I watched the lights of the Forge flicker, I realized that Vance was right. I wasn't just opening a home. I was waking up a mind that had been asleep for eons. And as that mind began to stretch and yawn, I could feel its hunger. It didn't just want to protect us, it wanted to be whole again. And to be whole, it needed the rest of the ring. I looked at my hands, the gray skin finally feeling like it belonged to me. We were the Keepers, and the house was finally coming back under new management. The journey ahead was going to be brutal. There would be more Xyloses, more Varrics, and eventually the full might of the 7 systems would come knocking at the heart's gate. But as I listened to the soft lullabies of the Aeon children echoing through the gardens, I knew we had already won the most important fight. We had remembered who we were. I spent the next 6 hours working with Vance and the refugee leaders to organize the first permanent camps. We chose a tier with a high concentration of fruit-bearing bioengineered plants and a steady supply of recycled water. The Aeons were incredibly efficient, their own technology interfacing seamlessly with the Forge's systems. It was as if they were 2 halves of a broken puzzle finally being brought back together. "Nix, look at this," Vance said, calling me over to a large holographic display in what appeared to be the Forge's central observatory. I walked over, my legs feeling like lead. On the display was a map of the entire zenith ring, the spire, the dredge, the agricultural rings. It was all there. But there were areas I had never seen before, dark zones that were now beginning to pulse with that same deep sapphire light. "What am I looking at?" I asked. "The resonance is spreading," Vance whispered, her eyes wide with a mix of terror and wonder. "When you opened the Heart's Gate and pushed back the enforcers, you triggered a system-wide reinitialization. The station isn't just waking up in the forge, it's waking up everywhere. Is that a bad thing?" "It depends," she said, pointing to a section of the spire that was currently flashing a violent warning red. "The station is identifying the convergence's modifications, their additions, their bypasses, their improvements, as foreign pathogens. It's starting to purge them, Nix. If we don't find a way to stabilize the interface, the ring is going to shake the convergence off like a dog shaking off fleas." I stared at the map. In my mind's eye, I saw the millions of people living in the upper decks, the families, the scholars, even the arrogant delegates. They weren't all monsters. Most of them were just people living their lives, unaware that their world was built on a foundation of stolen memory. "I have to stop it," I said. "How?" Vance asked. "You're the bridge, Nix, but the bridge only goes one way right now. You can talk to the station, but you can't tell it to ignore the damage it suffered for 5,000 years. "Then I have to find the source of the memory," I said, looking at Thalassa, who was standing at the edge of the observatory, looking out at the stars she had left behind. "The Aeons have the songs. My people have the resonance. But there's a third part, the station itself. It has a voice. I just have to find where it's buried." "The core," Vance said, nodding slowly. "The very center of the ring. But that's deep inside the heavy gravity well. No one has been there since the station was built. The pressures are enough to crush a tactical suit." "I don't need a suit," I said, looking at my glowing gray skin. "I have the soot. I have the conductor. I just need a way to get there." Kyle walked in, his face grim. "If you're going to the core, kid, you're going to need more than just a song." The enforcers are regrouping at the upper elevators. They've brought in the heavy hitters, the screamer squads with sonic dampeners. They're coming to put us down for good. "Let them come," I said, a strange, calm power rising within me. "But they're going to find out that the basement isn't the only place with secrets. Cal, get the dredgers ready. Not for a fight, for a shift." "A shift?" "Tell them to start humming," I said. "Every obsidian on this station. Tell them to sing the song of the loom. Let's see how their screamer squads handle a chorus of 20 million people." Kyle grinned, a wide, dangerous expression that reminded me of the man who had taught me how to survive the dredge. "Now that I can do. We'll give them a concert they'll never forget." As Kale hurried out to spread the word, I turned to Vance. "Keep the Aeon safe, and whatever happens, don't let them close the Heart's Gate. If that door shuts now, it's never opening again." "Good luck, Nix," Vance said, her voice trembling slightly. "Try not to get yourself dusted." "I'll do my best," I said. I stepped into the primary lift shaft of the forge, the one that led straight down into the darkness of the gravity well. As the platform began to drop, the weight of the station seemed to press down on me, the gravity increasing with every 100 meters. My skin began to glow brighter, the blue veins pulsing in time with the station's heart. The air grew hot, the smell of ancient, scorched circuits filling my lungs. I closed my eyes and began to hum. It was a low, steady sound, the same sound my father had made when he was working on the most stubborn machines. It was a sound of persistence, a sound of patience, a sound of memory, and deep in the dark, something answered. It wasn't a voice, it was a feeling of long-denied justice, a feeling of a debt finally being called in. I was no longer just Nix Thala, the Soot-Eater from 44. I was the voice of the Zenith Ring, and I was going to make sure the whole galaxy heard what I had to say. The descent took 45 minutes of bone-crushing pressure. By the time the lift stopped, I was struggling to breathe, my muscles screaming under the increased gravity. But as the doors opened, the pressure vanished. I stepped out into a room that was filled with nothing but light, a pure white radiance that seemed to come from the air itself. In the center of the room was a single, massive crystal, at least 20 meters tall. It was shot through with the same dark material as the heart's gate, but it was pulsing with every color of the spectrum. The memory core, I whispered. As I approached the crystal, the light shifted, forming shapes in the air. I saw the first keepers, their skin glowing like mine. I saw the construction of the ring, a massive undertaking of thousands of years. And I saw the arrival of the convergence, the first explorers who had looked at the miracle of the ring and seen only a resource to be exploited. I saw the betrayal. I saw the memory being stripped away, the history being burned, and the keepers being driven into the dark. I saw my ancestors, their eyes full of a grief that had lasted for millennia. I reached out and touched the crystal. The world vanished. I wasn't in the core anymore. I was everywhere. I was in the dredge, hearing the tired sighs of the workers. I was in the spire, hearing the fearful whispers of the delegates. I was in the forge, hearing the hopeful prayers of the Aeons. And I was in the heart's gate, feeling the raw, unfiltered rage of the station. Peace, or I thought, the word echoing through every corridor, every hub, every sector. We are not the monsters they made us. We are the keepers, and keepers do not destroy. We preserve. The rage didn't vanish, but it shifted. It became a cold, focused intent. The station stopped shaking. The red alerts in the spire faded to a steady, calm amber. The screamer squads, who had been preparing to storm the elevators, found their weapons suddenly powered down, their armor locking them in place. Across the entire zenith ring, 20 million obsidian began to hum. It was a sound that transcended language, a sound that carried the weight of 5,000 years of silence. It was a sound of reclamation. I pulled my hand back from the crystal, my body feeling lighter than air. I knew what I had to do now. The revolution wasn't going to be won with fire, it was going to be won with the truth. I stepped back into the lift, the gravity no longer a burden, but a familiar embrace. As I rose back toward the forge, I thought of the billions of souls waiting for a home, and the millions of people who were about to have their world turned upside down. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be war, there would be sacrifice, and there would be a long, painful process of healing the scars of the past. But for the first time in 5,000 years, the foundation was no longer hidden in the dark. We were the keepers of the zenith, and we were finally home. By the time the lift reached the observatory, the entire forge was bathed in a soft, sapphire glow. Thalassa was waiting for me, her veil completely clear. Her eyes were full of a deep, ancient wisdom. "You have found the voice," she said, her words a melody of triumph. "I found the memory," I corrected her, "and the memory says that there is room for everyone. But the price of admission has changed." "And what is the price?" Thalassa asked. I looked at Alara Vance, then at Kale, then out at the stars. "The price," I said, "is the end of the silence. No more forgotten races, no more discarded histories. From now on, the Zenith Ring belongs to those who remember what it means to be a wayfarer." And as the song of the loom reached its crescendo, shaking the very stars, I knew that the galaxy would never be the same again. The foundation had risen, and it was beautiful. But even as the celebration began, I saw a single dark ship approaching the Heart's Gate. It wasn't a convergence vessel. It wasn't an Aeon ship. It was something else, something older, something colder. The silence might have ended, but a new story was just beginning. And this time, I wasn't just a character in it. I was the one writing the words. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest, a resonance I didn't recognize. It was a warning. The memory core hadn't just shown me the past, it had shown me a glimpse of what was coming. And what was coming was far more dangerous than Magistrate Varric or the Seven Systems. "Nix? What is it?" Vance asked, her voice full of concern. "The ring remembers more than just us," I whispered, my eyes fixed on the approaching shadow. "It remembers the ones who built it, and they're coming back to see what we've done with their house." I looked at my hands, the blue glow pulsing with a new frantic urgency. We had found a home, yes, but now we had to fight to keep it. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if the Song of the Loom would be enough. The true test of the keepers had finally arrived, and the price of failure was the end of everything. I turned to Thalassa, the envoy of a dying sun, and I saw the same fear in her eyes that I felt in my own heart. We were all wayfarers now, drifting in the dark, hoping that the lights we had lit would be enough to guide us through the storm. "Prepare the forge," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my soul. "The builders are coming home, and they aren't going to like the new tenants." The next few hours were a scramble of defensive preparations. The soot on my skin was now a constant, low-level hum, feeding me data from every corner of the ring. I could feel the strange ship approaching. It didn't move like our vessels. It didn't use engines or thrusters. It simply folded space around itself, a series of micro-jumps that brought it closer to the Heart's Gate with every second. "Vance, can you get a lock on that ship?" I asked, my fingers flying across the observatory console. "I'm trying, Nix, but it's like trying to scan a black hole," she said, her voice tight with stress. "The sensors just slide right off the hull. Whatever that thing is made of, it predates any material science we have." "It's void glass," I said, the knowledge clicking into place from the depths of the memory core. "The same material as the Lass's veil, but on a massive scale. It's a ship made of condensed memory." Thalassa stood beside me, her robes shimmering with a frantic, silver light. "The architects," she whispered, "the ones who seeded the stars and wove the first looms. We thought they were long gone, faded into the deep silence of the void." "They aren't gone," I said, watching the shadow grow larger on the view screen. "They were just waiting for someone to finish the song." The shadow reached the Heart's Gate. There was no explosion, no flash of light. The gate simply dissolved, the sapphire light of the forge turning into a dull, gray mist. The ship, a sleek, needle-like sliver of absolute darkness, drifted into the chamber, coming to a halt directly above the hanging gardens. A voice echoed through the forge, a sound that didn't come from the air or the speakers. It came from the very center of our minds. "The loom is tangled, the threads are frayed, the keepers have forgotten their purpose." I stepped forward, my skin flaring into a brilliant, defiant blue. "We haven't forgotten," I shouted into the silence. "We've just changed the pattern." The needle ship pulsed once, a wave of gray energy washing over the gardens. The plants withered, the lights flickered, and the sapphire glow of the forge began to fade. "Patterns are for the architects to decide," the voice said, cold and indifferent. "The experiment has run its course. The zenith ring will be cleared. The loom will be reset." "You can't do that," I screamed, feeling the pain of the station as it was forcibly shut down. "There are billions of lives here, people who have nowhere else to go." "Lives are but threads," the voice responded. "Threads can be respun, reset in 3, 2, 1. The world began to dissolve. Not just the gate, but everything. The gardens, the tears, even the air itself started to turn into that gray, featureless mist. I felt my own body beginning to fray, the blue veins on my skin flickering and dying. But then I heard it. It wasn't one voice. It wasn't even 20 million. It was the entire zenith ring. Every pipe, every valve, every circuit, every soul. They all began to sing. It wasn't the song of the loom. It was something new, a chaotic, beautiful, stubborn melody of survival. I felt the resonance swell within me, a power far greater than anything I had ever imagined. I reached out and grabbed the fraying threads of the world, my hands glowing with a light that was both sapphire and starlight. "No!" I roared, the sound echoing through the very core of the architect's ship. "We are not your experiment. We are the keepers, and we are the ones who decide the pattern." The gray mist froze. The dissolution stopped. For a long, heart-pounding moment, the entire universe seemed to hold its breath. Then the architect's voice spoke again, and this time, there was a flicker of something new in the cold indifference. Surprise. "The threads, they are holding. The pattern is evolving." The needle ship pulsed again, but this time the energy was warm, a soft, golden light that washed away the gray. The gardens bloomed with a sudden, impossible vitality. The sapphire glow returned, stronger than ever. "Very well, keepers," the voice said, and for the first time, there was a hint of a smile in the resonance. "The loom is yours, for now. Show us the beauty of your new pattern. But know this, a loom that cannot hold its own threads will eventually collapse. The future is no longer written. It must be woven. The needle ship folded space and vanished, leaving the forge in a state of stunned, glowing silence. I fell to my knees, the blue glow on my skin fading to a soft, steady hum. I was exhausted, my mind a frayed mess of memories and echoes. But as I looked up at the billions of shimmering lights in the forge, I knew we had survived. The silence had ended, the builders had been answered, and the keepers were finally ready to begin. I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Kyle, his face covered in soot, but his eyes bright with a joy I had never seen before. "Well, kid," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I think we just finished the longest shift in history." "No, Kale," I said, a tired smile touching my lips as I looked at the new world we had protected. "I think the shift is just getting started." We stood together in the light of the forge, two Soot-Eaters from 44 who had rewritten the stars. The galaxy was still full of fear, prejudice, and ancient shadows. But as the first Aeon children began to sing the new song, I knew that the foundation was strong enough to hold whatever future we chose to weave. We were the keepers, and the zenith was finally, truly, our home. The victory over the architects felt less like a triumph and more like a stay of execution. The forge was alive, sapphire and starlight pulsing through the tiered gardens. But beyond the Heart's Gate, the zenith ring was a hornet's nest poked with a very large stick. The architects had left behind a lingering frequency, a cold, crystalline echo that made my teeth ache every time I closed my eyes. It was a reminder that we were small, threads in a pattern we barely understood. "This is a real kick in the teeth, Nix," Kale said, leaning against a glowing plinth. He had traded his hydro wrench for a pulse rifle he'd scavenged from a fallen enforcer, but he still looked like he belonged in the grease pits of Sector 44. "The hi-hats in the spire have cut the main nutrient lines. We've got 9 billion mouths to feed, and the forge's internal gardens aren't yielding fast enough. Varric's gone full metal. He's betting on a siege." I looked up at the vast amber-tinted dome of the forge. The starlight robes of the Aeon refugees were scattered across the lower tiers, like fallen petals. They were peaceful, yes, but they were hungry. 9 billion people. Even in a space this vast, the logistics were a nightmare. "He thinks if he starves the ghosts and the Soot-Eaters, we'll come crawling back to the elevators begging for a ration pack," I said, the blue glow on my skin flickering with my irritation. "He's still treating us like an equipment failure he can just patch over with a bit of pressure." "Well, some of the boys are starting to get twitchy," Kyle muttered, his eyes shifting toward a group of younger Obsidian who were practicing drills on the plaza below. They weren't humming lullabies, they were shouting war cries. "They're tired of being the floor mats. They want to take the fight to the spire. They're saying if the station belongs to us now, we should start acting like the landlords." This was the friction I had feared. The prejudice of the convergence had left a scar, and now that my people had power, the first instinct was to use it as a lash. It was the same old pattern, just with different hands on the whip. "If we storm the spire, Kale, we aren't keepers. We're just the next batch of tyrants," I said. "Tell that to a mother who can't find a meal slug for her kid," Kale snapped. "The hi-hats aren't just cutting food, Nix. They've blocked the medical channels. We've got an outbreak of lung rot in Tier 7, the old soot coughs from the dredge. Without the Convergence's medkits, they're going to buy the farm." I felt the weight of it then, a physical pressure on my chest. This was the cost of the new pattern. It wasn't just about singing to the stars. It was about the gritty, ugly reality of 9 billion lives. "Where is Vance?" I asked, needing something logic-based to hold on to. "In the archives. She's been bunkered down for 24 hours. Says she found a hitch in the station's resonance." I found Alara Vance in a room filled with holographic data streams that looked like a storm of golden sand. She looked like she'd been through a centrifuge. Her hair was a bird's nest, and her eyes were bloodshot. "Nix, thank the stars," she said, waving me over. "Look at this. The resonance you triggered when you faced the needle ship. It didn't just wake the station. It started a countdown." "A countdown to what?" "Harmonic dissipation," Vance said, pointing to a graph that was plummeting toward a red line. "The zenith ring was designed for balance. It needs the high and the low to function. By locking the forge away from the rest of the station, we've created a pressure differential. The energy is pooling here, in the core, and starving the outer rings. If we don't reintegrate the station's consciousness within 72 hours, the life support systems in the spire will fail, and then the forge will overcharge and detonate. So Varric's siege is actually killing him, and he doesn't even know it? I asked. Exactly, but it's going to kill us too. We can't stay isolated, Nix. The pattern requires the whole loom. If we cut out the threads we don't like, the hi-hats, the delegates, the people who oppressed us, the whole thing unravels. I looked at the data. It was the ultimate test. My people wanted revenge. Varric wanted control. And the station demanded unity, or it would turn us all into dust. I have to talk to him, I said. He won't listen to a dredger, Vance said. He's already labeled you a terrorist and a biological weapon. Then I won't go as a dredger, I said, looking at my hands. The blue light was steady now, pulsing with the same rhythm as the memory core. I'll go as the voice he can't ignore. I left the archives and headed for the Heart's Gate. Cal tried to stop me, his hand heavy on my arm. Nix, don't blow a fuse, he said, his voice dropping to a low, rough growl. If you walk into the spire now, they'll flatline you before you can say a word. Varric's got screamer squads on every level of the lift shafts. I'm not taking the lifts, Kyle, I said. I'm taking the resonance. Tell the Obsidian to start the Song of the Loom again. But this time, tell them to make it a bridge, not a wall. A bridge? To those bastards? If we don't build it, Kyle, this whole station becomes a tomb for 9 billion refugees and every person you've ever known. Do it. That's an order from the Keeper. Cal looked at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. Then he spat on the floor and nodded. Fine, but if you get dusted, don't come crying to me in the void. I stepped through the Heart's Gate, not into the tunnel, but into the vibration itself. I felt the bioreactive polymer on my skin stretch and hum as I projected my consciousness into the station's network. I wasn't walking, I was flowing through the conduits, a streak of sapphire light moving through the dark veins of the Zenith Ring. I bypassed the Screamer squads, their sensors only registering a faint, harmonic interference. I bypassed the security bulkheads and the pressurized seals. I moved through the spire like a ghost, feeling the fear of the people living there. The wealthy, the powerful, the people who had never looked down at the dredge except to check their profit margins. Their fear was a bitter, metallic taste in the air. I materialized in the high conclave chamber, directly in front of Magistrate Varric's desk. He didn't scream. He was too professional for that, but his face went as white as his silk robes, and his hand flew to the alarm button on his console. The alarms won't work, Varric, I said, my voice echoing through the room with a weight that made the heavy glass windows rattle. The station has decided that you're in a timeout. You monster, Varric hissed, his eyes darting around the empty chamber. What have you done to the grid? My engineers report a total system collapse in 40 sectors. The system isn't collapsing, Varric. It's starving, I said, stepping closer. I didn't look like a girl from the docks anymore. The sapphire light was pouring out of my eyes and my voice carried the resonance of 10,000 years of history. Your siege is killing the ring. In 72 hours, the life support in this spire will shut down. You'll be gasping for air in your silk chairs while the forge burns. You're lying, he said, though I could see the sweat beading on his upper lip. It's a trick, a linguistic illusion. Look at your own diagnostic feeds, if they're still working, I said. The forge is overcharging. The energy needs to flow back into the outer rings, or the whole station detonates. We need to open the lines. We need to share the nutrient stores. We need to reintegrate. Share? Varric laughed, a sharp, jagged sound. With 9 billion aliens and a race of biological conduits who just tried to erase us? You want me to hand over the sovereignty of the convergence to a bunch of ghosts? I want you to save your people, I said. The Aeons aren't ghosts. They're engineers, doctors, and artists. They have technology that could fix your failing power grid in an hour. And my people, the Obsidian, we aren't your slaves anymore. We are the keepers of the foundation. You can't have the spire without the base, Varric. The pattern requires both. Varric stood up, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and desperation. I will not negotiate with a tool. You were designed to scrape pipes, Nixthala. You were designed to be the grease in the gears. To think you can stand here and dictate terms to the High Conclave is an insult to the very concept of order. Order is a lie if it's built on a grave, I said. You have 24 hours to decide. Open the nutrient lines and allow the Aeon medical teams into the spire, or start counting your final breaths. The station is waking up, Varric, and it doesn't like the way you've been treating its heart. I began to dissolve back into the resonance, the sapphire light fading as I prepared to return to the forge. Wait, Varric shouted, his voice cracking. If I do this, if I open the lines, what's to stop your people from just finishing what they started? What's to stop them from dusting us all the moment they're fed? I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt the true weight of the humanistic lesson I was trying to teach. Prejudice wasn't just about hating the other. It was about the fear that the other was exactly like you. Nothing, I said, except the fact that we're better than you. We've spent 5,000 years at the bottom, Varric. We know what it feels like to be hungry, and we've decided we don't want anyone else to feel that way. Not even you. I vanished, leaving the magistrate alone in his silent, amber-lit palace. When I returned to the forge, I was exhausted. The blue light on my skin was dim, and my head felt like it had been kicked by a freight loader. Cal was waiting for me, his face grim. He didn't buy it, did he? I don't know, I said, leaning against the Heart's Gate. He's scared, Kyle. Scared people make bad choices. Well, the boys in Tier 3 aren't waiting for him to make a choice, Kale said. They've found a way to override the heavy lift elevators. They're planning to storm the spire at midnight. They say they're going to liberate the nutrient vats themselves. No, I said, pushing myself off the wall. If they do that, the resonance will turn violent. The station will identify the conflict as a system-wide infection and trigger the reset. We have to stop them. How? They won't listen to you anymore, Nix. They think you've gone soft. They think the starlight has gone to your head. I looked at the sapphire glow of the forge, then at the dark, soot-stained hands of my friend. The turning point was here. I could either be the leader they wanted, a vengeful goddess who led them to a bloody victory, or I could be the keeper they needed. I need to find the Fated, I said. The Fated? Those old scrap heads in the deep damp? What for? They can barely walk, let alone fight. They don't need to fight, I said. They need to remember. There's a piece of the song missing, Kyle. A piece that isn't about power or light. It's about the dirt. And I think they're the only ones who still have it. The test had begun, not against Varric, but against our own hearts. And as the countdown to harmonic dissipation ticked away in the background, I realized that saving the station was going to be the easy part. Saving ourselves from becoming what we hated, that was the real struggle. The deep damp was a section of the forge that even the Aeons avoided. It was where the water reclamation systems leaked into the structural foundations, creating a subterranean world of rusted iron, thick moss, and a humidity that felt like breathing through a wet sponge. This was where the Fated lived, obsidian workers whose bioreactive polymer had been damaged by overexposure to toxic chemicals or simply by age. They didn't glow. Their skin was a dull, sickly charcoal, and their resonance was so faint it was almost silent. This place is a real dump, Nix, Kyle whispered, his hand hovering over the grip of his rifle as we picked our way across a bridge of salvaged plating. Why would anyone choose to live down here when the gardens are right upstairs? They didn't choose it, Kale, I said, the blue light from my skin casting long, distorted shadows against the dripping walls. The younger obsidian, the ones who can glow, they look at the Fated like they're broken equipment. They're ashamed of them. They think the Fated are a reminder of the dredge. Well, they are, aren't they? Kale muttered. I mean, look at them. In the shadows beneath the massive intake pipes, I could see them. Dozens of elderly obsidian huddled around small chemical heaters. They were wrapped in rags, their eyes clouded with cataracts, their hands gnarled by centuries of manual labor. They didn't look like keepers. They looked like the discarded scraps of a civilization. A man stepped out from behind a rusted pillar. He was ancient, his back bent into a permanent curve, his skin so gray it was almost white in the sapphire light. He held a staff made of a bent copper pipe, and his eyes were surprisingly sharp. You're a long way from the starlight, girl, he said, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like sandpaper on stone. I'm looking for Elder Bran, I said. You're looking at him, though I don't know why a shining one would want anything to do with a piece of slag like me. I'm the keeper, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Bran let out a short, hacking laugh. The keeper? You. You look like you've been dipped in neon and told you're a god. But you don't know the first thing about this station, do you? I know that the station is dying, I said. I know that the resonance is pooling in the core and that we have less than 48 hours before it detonates. Bran's expression didn't change. He simply leaned on his pipe and looked at me. And you think some old scrapheads in the damp have the answer? We can't even open a nutrient tube without a pry bar, girl. Our resonance died out 50 years ago. It didn't die, I said, stepping closer. I could feel the faint, rhythmic thrumming of the station beneath the floor plates. But here, it was different. It wasn't a song. It was a heartbeat, a slow, steady, stubborn pulse. You're the only ones who can hear the foundation, the younger obsidian. They're so busy shining that they've forgotten how to listen to the dirt. They want to storm the spire. They want revenge. And why shouldn't they? Bran asked, his voice suddenly hard. I spent 60 years in Sector 44. I watched my brother get crushed by a gravity shear because the High Conclave wouldn't spend 10 credits on a new stabilizer. I've got enough lung rot to kill a herd of vor beasts. Why should I care if the spire burns? Because if it burns, we burn with it, I said. And because the Aeons, the 9 billion people we saved, they aren't the ones who oppressed you. They're just wayfarers like us. If we let our anger reset the station, we're just as bad as Varric. We're choosing to be the monsters they said we were. Bran looked away, his eyes fixed on the dripping water. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant rhythmic thud of the reclamation pumps. The song of the loom, Bran whispered. Your grandmother taught it to you, didn't she? Yes. She was a smart woman, but she only taught you the melody. The melody is the light. It's the part that opens the doors and wakes the machines. But every song needs a bass line, Nixthala. Every loom needs a frame. The frame, I repeated. That's what's missing. The resonance is pooling because it has nothing to hold it in place. It's like water without a pipe. Exactly, Bran said. He turned back to me, his gaze intense. The faded. We don't glow because we aren't meant to. We're the ground wire. Our job isn't to project the light. It's to absorb the excess. We're the ones who keep the station from shaking itself to pieces when the shining ones get too loud. Then you have to come with me, I said. We need to go to the central relay. We need the faded to act as the stabilizers while I reintegrate the rings. You want us to climb 3 levels of service stairs? Bran laughed again, but this time it was bitter. Look at us, girl. We're 1 step away from the reclamation vats. We'd be lucky to make it to the lift shaft. I'll carry you if I have to, I said. Kale will help. We'll get every obsidian who still remembers the dredge. This isn't about being broken equipment, Bran. This is about being the only ones who are strong enough to hold the weight. Cal stepped forward, his rifle lowered. He looked at the old men in the shadows, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He wasn't seeing scrapheads anymore. He was seeing his father. He was seeing himself in 30 years. I've got a couple of heavy-duty freight sleds in the depot, Cal said, his voice surprisingly gentle. We can load them up. It'll be a bumpy ride, but we'll get you there. Bran looked at the other faded. They were watching him, their faces unreadable in the dark. One by one, they began to stand up. It was a slow, painful process, the sound of joints popping and bones creaking. But they stood. All right, Shining One, Bran said, pointing his pipe at me. We'll give you your frame, but don't think for a second that this means we've forgiven the high hats. We're doing this for the kids and for the ghosts. We spent the next 4 hours moving the faded out of the deep damp. It was a logistical nightmare. The younger obsidian, the ones who were preparing for the assault on the spire, watched us with confusion and open mockery. What are you doing with the junk pile, Nix? One of the squad leaders asked, his skin pulsing with an aggressive neon blue light. We're about to take the spire, and you're wasting time with a bunch of unawakened? They aren't junk, Jax, I said, not stopping. They're the only reason you aren't going to detonate the moment you hit the heavy lifts. Get out of the way. You've lost it, Nix, Jax sneered. Varric's offered a deal. He sent a transmission an hour ago. He's willing to grant full citizenship to any Obsidian who helps him neutralize the Aeon threat. He says he has a cure for the soot skin. He says we can be human. I stopped then, a cold dread settling in my gut. Xylos. This was his work. He was offering them the one thing they had always wanted: to be normal, to be accepted, to be scrubbed clean of the heritage that had made them outcasts. It's a lie, Jax, I said. The soot isn't a disease. It's your connection to the station. If you cure it, you're just a man in a cage. You'll be even more of a slave than you were in the dredge because you won't even have the song to keep you company. I don't care about the song, Jax shouted, his resonance flaring into a violent, jagged red. I want to live in the spire. I want to wear silk. I want to look at a delegate and not have him look through me like I'm a ghost. Then you're already a ghost, Jax, I said. Because you're willing to erase who you are just to be tolerated by people who hate you. Jax looked like he wanted to strike me, but the presence of the fated seemed to unnerve him. Bran stepped forward, his staff clicking on the floor plates. He didn't say a word, but the silence he projected was heavy, a dense, grounding frequency that seemed to dampen Jax's neon blue glow. Let him through, boy, Bran said, before you glow yourself into a short circuit. Jax backed away, his face contorted with a mixture of fury and uncertainty. But I knew this wasn't over. The cure was a powerful temptation. The prejudice we had suffered for generations had made us vulnerable to the idea that we were fundamentally wrong. We reached the central relay, a massive circular chamber at the base of the spire's primary gravity well. This was where the energy from the forge was supposed to be distributed to the rest of the ring. Now, it was a swirling vortex of sapphire energy, the air crackling with static. It's worse than I thought, Vance said, meeting us at the entrance. The harmonic differential is at 90%. If we don't start the reintegration now, the feedback loop will become irreversible. All right, Bran, I said, turning to the old man. Show me the frame. Bran nodded. He directed the fated to form a circle around the central relay, their freight sleds arranged like the spokes of a wheel. They sat on the floor, their backs to the energy vortex, their hands linked. All right, scrapheads, Bran shouted over the roar of the relay. You know the drill. Don't try to shine. Just be the dirt. When the light hits you, let it pass through. Don't hold it. Don't fight it. Just stay grounded. I stepped into the center of the circle, directly beneath the energy vortex. The pressure was immense, a physical weight that threatened to crush my lungs. I closed my eyes and reached for the memory core, projecting my consciousness into the station's network one more time. Protocol 010, reintegration. Open the outer rings. Balance the loom. The station shrieked in protest. The energy vortex flared into a blinding, white-hot brilliance, and a wave of raw power surged out from the relay. I felt it hit me, a jagged, violent current of pure information and energy. It was too much. I couldn't hold it. The soot on my skin began to crack, the blue light turning into a painful, searing white. Nix! Vance screamed. I was falling into the white, my identity dissolving into the station's frantic, dying consciousness. I was becoming the explosion. But then I felt the ground. It wasn't just the floor plates. It was a connection, a slow, steady, stubborn pull that anchored me to the earth. I felt the fated. I felt their silence. I felt their strength. They were absorbing the excess energy, their unawakened skin acting as a massive heat sink for the station's rage. They weren't glowing, but they were holding. Thank you, I thought, my mind finally clearing. I grabbed the threads of the energy vortex and began to weave. I didn't use the high melodic song of the Aeons. I used the low, rough cadence of the dredge. I used the sound of hammers on iron, the sound of steam in the pipes, the sound of 20 million people breathing in the dark. I pushed the energy out of the forge and into the outer rings. I felt the spire's systems flicker back to life. I felt the nutrient lines open. I felt the life support system stabilize. The sapphire light began to flow through the entire zenith ring, a steady, balanced pulse that reached from the deepest dredge to the highest spire. The vortex began to shrink, the white-hot brilliance fading back into a soft sapphire glow. I pulled my consciousness back, my body hitting the floor with a heavy thud. I was gasping for air, my skin feeling like it had been scrubbed with acid. But I was alive. I looked around the room. The fated were still sitting in their circle. They looked exhausted, their gray skin even paler than before. But they were alive too. Bran was leaning on his pipe, a tired, triumphant grin on his face. "Not bad, Shining One," he rasped. "Not bad for a girl from 44. "We did it," Vance said, her eyes bright with tears as she looked at her data slate. "The harmonic differential is back to 0. The station is stable." But the celebration was short-lived. A shadow fell over the entrance to the relay chamber. I looked up and saw Jax, but he wasn't alone. Behind him were dozens of obsidian workers, their skin no longer gray or blue. They were pink, raw, and bleeding, their soot having been forcibly removed with a chemical solvent. They looked like flayed animals, their eyes wide with a horrific, drug-induced euphoria. And in the center of the group stood Xylos, a gleaming silver injector in his hand. "The cure is a success, Nyx," Xylos said, his voice smooth and cold. "The magistrate is very pleased, and now we're going to clean up the rest of this mess." I looked at Jax, his face a mask of pain and false joy. He had traded his heritage for a lie, and now he was the weapon the Convergence would use to destroy us from the within. "Jax, no," I whispered. "Look at what they've done to you." "I'm human, Nyx," Jax shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm one of them, and I'm going to make sure you never shine again." He stepped forward, his flayed hands reaching for a pulse rifle. The turning point had passed, and the civil war I had tried to prevent had finally arrived. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about the very soul of the Obsidian people. I stood up, my skin glowing with a faint, steady blue. I didn't want to fight my own people. I didn't want to see them bleed. But as Xylos raised his injector, I realized that the prejudice we had fought against wasn't just in the spire. It was in the hearts of those who believed they were only worthy if they were normal. "Bran, get the others out of here," I said, my voice cold. "Kale, Vance, get behind me." "What about you, Nyx?" Kale asked, his rifle ready. "I'm going to show them that being clean doesn't mean being whole," I said. The first shot rang out, and the relay chamber turned into a battlefield of blue light and red blood. The test was no longer about saving the station. It was about saving the people who had forgotten how to be themselves. As the battle raged around me, I looked at Jax, my heart breaking for the man who had been so desperate to be human that he had destroyed the very thing that made him special. And I knew that even if we won this fight, the scar of Zolas's cure would haunt us for generations. The pattern was still evolving, but this thread was drenched in blood. "Nyx, watch out!" Kyle screamed. A blast of energy hit the central relay, and the sapphire light flared into a violent, warning red once again. The architect's needleship had vanished, but the silence they had left behind was now being filled with the screams of our own people. We had found a home, but we were still learning how to live in it. I closed my eyes and began to hum, not for the station, but for the flayed men who were trying to kill me. I sang for their pain, for their shame, and for the heritage they had tried to throw away. It was a song of mourning, a song for the ones who had lost their way in the light. And as the resonance filled the room, I saw Jax hesitate, his flayed hands trembling. For a second, just a second, I saw the gray return to his eyes. "Remember, Jax," I whispered through the resonance. "Remember the loom." But then Xylos stepped forward and plunged the injector into Jax's neck, and the gray vanished, replaced by a screaming, hollow white. The fight was just beginning, and the cost of the lesson was higher than I had ever imagined. I realized then that prejudice isn't just something done to us. It's a poison we drink ourselves when we decide that we aren't enough. And as I faced the flayed army of my own brothers, I knew that the only way to save them was to be the one thing they were most afraid of, the keeper who would never be clean. "Kyle, Vance, Bran, hold the line," I said, my voice echoing with the power of the core. "I'm going to end this." I stepped into the fray, a girl made of sapphire and soot, fighting to save a future that was being torn apart by the ghosts of the past. The turning point was behind us. The blood was on the floor, and the zenith ring was waiting to see who would be left to weave the next pattern. I felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The station wasn't just a machine, and it wasn't just a lifeboat. It was a mirror, and right now it was reflecting the very worst of us. If I wanted to change the pattern, I had to change the reflection. I didn't aim my resonance at the flayed men. I aimed it at the spire's broadcast network. I didn't send a message of war. I sent the image of Jax, his bleeding skin, his hollow eyes, his stolen soul. I sent it to every screen in the ring, from the spire to the dredge. Look at your cure, I shouted through the network. Look at what they want to do to us. They don't want us to be human. They want us to be empty. Across the station, millions of people stopped. They looked at the screens. They saw the price of acceptance. They saw the horror of the flayed men. And the humming began, not just in the relay chamber, but everywhere. A slow, deep, mournful sound that rose from the very bones of the station. The cure was a lie. And for the first time, the entire Zenith ring knew it. Xylos looked around, his face finally showing a flicker of real fear as the resonance of 20 million people began to rattle the very air in the chamber. This isn't possible, he screamed. The pattern is changing, Xylos, I said, my voice calm and steady, and you aren't in it. The sapphire light flared one last time, and the cure in Jax's veins seemed to freeze, the white-hot euphoria being washed away by the cold, stubborn strength of the station's memory. Jax collapsed, his breathing ragged, but his eyes were finally his own again. The battle wasn't over, but the lie was dead. And in the silence that followed, I knew that the Keepers had finally found their true strength, not in the light and not in the power, but in the courage to be exactly who we were, soot-stained, scarred, and beautiful. We were the wayfarers, and we were finally home. The relay chamber smelled of copper and ozone, a heavy metallic scent that clung to the back of my throat. Jax lay on the floor, his chest heaving, his raw, pink skin shimmering with a cold, chemical sweat. He looked like something that had been half born and then abandoned. Around him, the other flayed men were in various stages of collapse. The violent euphoria of Xylos's toxin replaced by a crushing, hollow agony. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were just broken boys who had traded their heritage for a handful of silver lies. "Don't touch me," Jax rasped as I knelt beside him. His voice was thin, a jagged echo of the friend I'd grown up with in Sector 44. I'm one of them now, Nix. I'm clean." "You aren't clean, Jax," I said, my voice thick with a grief that felt older than the station itself. I reached out, my sapphire glow skin casting a soft light over his flayed hands. "You're just empty. He didn't give you a cure. He gave you a cage. It felt so light," he whispered, a single tear tracking through the raw flesh of his cheek. "For 1 minute, I didn't feel the weight of the soot. I didn't feel the stare of the hi-hats. I was just a person." "You were always a person," I said, my heart breaking for the sheer scale of the lie he'd bought. "The weight wasn't the soot, Jax. It was the way they made you feel about it." Kyle stepped up beside me, his pulse rifle held loosely at his side. He looked down at the flayed men with a mixture of disgust and pity. "The brass and the spire are really something else, aren't they? They can't beat us with guns, so they try to talk us into killing ourselves. It's a low-res move, even for Varric." "They didn't just try, Kale," Ilara Vance said, walking over from the central relay console. Her face was pale, her fingers trembling as she adjusted her data lens. "The toxin Xylos used, it's a targeted retrovirus. It doesn't just strip the bioreactive polymer, it rewrites the neural pathways. It severs the connection to the station's resonance permanently. Even if we could grow the polymer back, these men, they'll never hear the song again. They're tone-deaf to the universe." A collective groan went up from the faded, who were still gathered in the circle. Brand stood up, his copper-piped staff clicking against the floor plates. He looked at Jax with a gaze that held no judgment, only a deep, weary understanding. "The silence is a heavy thing to carry," Brand said. "I've spent 40 years listening to the hum of the pumps, and even I would be lost without it. To have it ripped out of you, that's a special kind of cruelty." "We have to fix them," I said, looking at Vance. "I don't know if we can, Nix," she replied. "The damage is deep, and we have bigger problems. Look at the feeds." She activated a holographic map of the spire. The sapphire light I had pushed into the outer rings was holding, but the magistrate hadn't given up. He had activated the atmospheric purge protocols in the sectors surrounding the forge. He wasn't just trying to starve us anymore. He was trying to suffocate the entire population of 9 billion refugees. "He's venting the air?" Kyle shouted, his voice echoing with fury. "There are kids up there, Aeon teachers and Obsidian families who just moved into the transition tiers. He's banking on the fact that we'll have to use the station's energy to seal the leaks," Vance explained. "And if we do that, we'll lose the stabilization in the core. It's a zero-sum game. Either the refugees suffocate or the station detonates. He's forcing your hand, Nix." I stood up, the blue light on my skin flaring into a brilliant, defiant sapphire. The turning point hadn't just been the battle. It was this moment, right here. I could feel the station's panic, a frantic, vibrating hunger for balance. The pattern was screaming for a resolution. "He thinks I'll choose," I said, my voice resonant with the power of the memory core. "He thinks I'll pick one side and let the other burn. But he's still thinking in terms of high and low. He's still thinking like a man who owns the air." "What are you going to do?" Bran asked. "I'm going to stop being a bridge," I said, "and I'm going to become the atmosphere." I turned to Thalassa, who had appeared at the entrance to the relay chamber. She looked at the flayed men, her dark eyes full of a morning light. She walked over to Jax and placed a hand of shimmering starlight over his heart. "The resonance is not in the skin," Thalassa said, her voice a melody of pure truth. "It is in the memory of the light. Even in the silence, the soul remembers the song." "Can you help them?" I asked. "We can offer them our light," she said. "The Aeon carry the resonance of a dying sun within our own biology. If we interface with their nervous systems, we can act as the conductors they have lost. We can be their skin if they will be our foundation." "A symbiosis," Vance whispered, her scientific mind racing. "The Aeons provide the signal, and the Obsidian provide the grounding. It would bridge the gap that Xylos tried to create." "It will be painful," Thalassa warned, looking at Jax. "To feel the universe through another soul is a weight few can bear." Jax looked up at her, his raw face twisting in a grimace of hope. Anything is better than this silence. It's like being buried alive in my own head." I watched as the Aeons began to move among the flayed men, their robes of light blending with the gray shadows of the relay chamber. It was a beautiful, terrible sight, the oldest race in the galaxy reaching out to the most discarded. This was the transformation I had sensed. It wasn't just about survival. It was about the painful, messy process of becoming something new. "Kyle, stay here with Bran," I said. "Protect the relay. If Varric tries to send more flayed squads, blow the elevators. I don't care about the logistics anymore. Just keep the core stable." "And where are you going?" Kyle asked, his hand tightening on his rifle. "I'm going to the Spire," I said. "One last time. Not to negotiate. I'm going to show Varric that you can't purge the air without losing the right to breathe." "Nix, wait," Vance said, handing me a small crystalline drive. "This is the decryption key for the station's clean slate protocol. Varric doesn't know I have it. If things go south, if he tries to trigger a total reset, this is the only thing that can override the hardline. I hope I don't have to use it," I said, tucking the drive into my coveralls. I didn't flow through the conduits this time. I walked. I walked through the service corridors, through the transition tiers, through the places where the air was already growing thin. I saw the faces of the people through the reinforced glass of the bulkheads. Aeon mothers holding their children. Obsidian workers trying to seal the vents with nothing but scrap metal and hope. They looked at me as I passed, their eyes wide with a desperate, silent question. Will we live? I didn't have an answer. All I had was the song. I reached the Spire's primary command hub. The doors didn't open for me, so I spoke to them. A single, focused harmonic blast shattered the crystalline seals, and I stepped into the room. Magistrate Varric was standing at the central overlook, his back to me. He was watching the holographic displays of the venting sectors, his fingers dancing over a series of red icons. He looked older than he had 24 hours ago, his silk robes wrinkled, his face a mask of cold, calculated cruelty. "You're late, Nixthala," he said, not turning around. 3 sectors have already reached critical oxygen levels. 12,000 lives snuffed out like candles, and the count is rising. "Stop it, Varric," I said, the sapphire light of my skin illuminating the dark room. You've already lost. The station is reintegrating. The Aeons and the Obsidian are forming a symbiosis. Your cure has failed. Varric turned then, and I saw the true extent of his madness. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the console. Failed? No, it hasn't failed. It has simply evolved. If I cannot have a station of order, I will have a station of silence. The clean slate is the only logical conclusion. You'd kill everyone, I asked, my voice trembling, with a mixture of rage and disbelief. 6 million people in the spire? Your own family? Your own people? They are already dead, Nyx, he screamed, his voice cracking. The moment you open that gate, the moment you let the ghosts and the Soot-Eaters take the core, the convergence died. I am simply performing the funeral rites. He lunged for the clean slate master key, a heavy obsidian cylinder that sat in a recessed slot on the console. I didn't use a rifle. I didn't use a baton. I used the resonance. I let out a sound that wasn't a song. It was a scream of 5,000 years of suppressed history, of 1,000,000 broken lungs and 1,000,000,000 forgotten lives. The sound hit the console like a physical shockwave, shattering the holographic displays and throwing Varric across the room. The magistrate hit the wall and slumped to the floor, the clean slate key rolling away from his grasping hand. I stepped forward, my boots clicking on the polished floor. I picked up the master key. It felt cold, heavy, and full of a dark, stagnant energy. This was the weapon the architects had left behind, the ultimate reset for a pattern they no longer cared for. Give it back, Varric gasped, his voice a ragged whisper. You don't know what you're doing. You're just a tool. You're grease. You're just grease. I looked down at him, and for a moment I felt the urge to end it, to use the resonance to flatline his heart and be done with the man who had caused so much suffering. It would be so easy. It would be justice. But then I felt the drive in my pocket. I felt the connection to Jax and Thalassa. I felt the 9 billion lives waiting in the dark. If I killed him out of revenge, I was just another thread in his pattern. I was just the next magistrate. I'm not Grease, Varric, I said, my voice calm and steady. I'm the keeper. And a keeper doesn't just hold the past. A keeper protects the future. I didn't trigger the clean slate. I didn't destroy the key. Instead, I did something Varric could never have imagined. I interfaced the clean slate drive with the memory core. I began to hum, not the song of the loom, not the low-res grind of the dredge. I sang a song of integration. I sang a song that invited the spire, the forge, and the dredge to look at each other. I opened the station's neural network to every mind on the ring. Look at him, I whispered into the resonance. Across the station, every person, from the highest delegate to the lowest Soot-Eater, saw Varric. They felt his fear. They felt his madness. They felt the cold, hollow logic that had led him to vent the air. And then I made them feel each other. The spire felt the hunger of the forge. The forge felt the pride of the spire. The obsidian felt the shimmering hope of the Aeons. For 1 second, one impossible, blinding second, the prejudice was gone. There was no other. There was only the ring. The atmospheric purge stopped. The vents sealed. The energy levels in the core stabilized as the station found a new, complex equilibrium. The clean slate key in my hand turned from obsidian to a soft, translucent sapphire, the destructive code rewritten by the collective resonance of 15 billion souls. Varric stared up at me, his eyes full of a horror that was far deeper than the fear of death. He had seen the truth. He had felt the lives he tried to erase. He was no longer the high magistrate. He was just a man who had realized he was a ghost in his own world. What have you done? He whispered. I've made you part of the pattern, Varric, I said, whether you like it or not. I walked away from him, leaving the master key on the shattered console. I had reached the heart of the action, and I had made my choice. The transformation had begun, and it was the most painful thing I had ever experienced. But as I stepped out into the corridor, I saw the first breaths of fresh air returning to the sector. The station was whole, for now. But as I looked out the viewport at the endless void of space, I knew that the architects were still out there. And they wouldn't be the only ones coming for the Zenith Ring. The Convergence was a galactic entity, and Varric was only one man. There were 6 other systems, each with their own magistrates and their own armies. The war for the future had only just begun. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting for a seat at the table. I was the one who had built the table, and it was big enough for everyone. The aftermath of the integration event, as Alara Vance began to call it, was a chaotic, beautiful mess. The spire was no longer a forbidden palace. The transition tiers were filled with a strange, burgeoning culture. Part obsidian grit, part Aeon light, and part convergence luxury. People were talking, not through translators but through the resonance, a shared understanding that bypassed the need for logic. Jax was sitting on the edge of a tiered fountain in the forge's central plaza. His skin was still raw, but it was starting to heal, a strange pearlescent sheen beginning to form where the soot had once been. Thalassa sat beside him, her starlight hand resting on his shoulder. They looked like a living statue of the new world. "How does it feel?" I asked, sitting down on the other side of the fountain. Jax looked at me, and for the first time his eyes weren't full of shadows. "It's loud, Nyx. So loud. I can feel the station's water flow. I can feel the Aeon's heartbeats. It's like living in a thunderstorm." He smiled, a genuine, shaky expression. "But I'm not alone anymore. Even in the silence, I can feel her." "The symbiosis is holding," Thalassa said. "The flayed are no longer empty. They are the heralds of the new pattern. They carry the light of Oros within the frame of the Zenith." "Varric's in the med bay," Kale said, walking up to join us. He had swapped his rifle for a datapad, his brow furrowed as he looked at a series of logistical charts. "He's physically fine, but his brain is a bit of a scrambled egg. The doctors say he's in a state of empathetic shock. He literally can't stop crying every time he sees an Aeon child." "It's a fitting end for him," Brand said, leaning on his staff. The old faded man looked stronger than he had in years, his charcoal skin glowing with a faint, internal warmth. To be forced to feel the weight of the people he tried to erase. That's a heavier sentence than any prison. "The Convergence isn't going to let this go, you know," Vance said, appearing from the crowd. She looked like she'd finally had a full night's sleep, though her eyes were still focused on the long-term data. 3 heavy cruisers from the Veloni system have just exited warp at the edge of the ring. They've seen the broadcast. They've seen the integration. They're coming to restore order. "Let them come," I said, standing up. "We have the Heart's Gate, we have the Forge, and we have the Resonance." "It's not that simple, Nyx," Vance said, her voice serious. "They've seen what you can do. They know you can rewrite the station's code. They won't try to occupy the ring. They'll try to glass it from orbit. If they can't own the miracle, they'll destroy it so no one else can." I looked at the sapphire light of the Forge. The humanistic lesson I had learned wasn't just about mercy. It was about the responsibility of preservation. To protect the future, you had to be willing to change the rules of the present. "Then we won't be here when they arrive," I said. The group went silent. Cal looked at me like I'd finally bugged out. "What do you mean, not be here? This station is 1,200 kilometers long, Nyx. It's a Dyson ring fragment. You can't just put it in a pocket and walk away." "The architects didn't build the Zenith Ring to be a station, Cal," I said, the knowledge from the memory core flowing through me like a river of starlight. "They didn't build it to stay in one place. The 7 systems found it drifting, but it was never meant to be a static colony. It's a ship, the largest ship ever built, a Wayfarer's Ark." "You're saying we can jump?" Vance whispered, her eyes widening. "The entire station?" "The memory core has the coordinates," I said. "The place where the architects went, the place where the pattern is complete. If we can reach the jump point before the Veloni's cruisers arrive, we can save everyone. But it requires a total integration. Every soul on this station has to hum. One song, one resonance. If even one person refuses, the jump field will collapse and rip us apart." 15 billion people? Kyle asked, his voice full of skepticism. "You want 15 billion people to sing together? You've seen how we are, Nyx. We can't even agree on ration pulp. There are still people in the Spire who hate us. There are still Obsidian who want to burn the delegates." "That's the test, Kale," I said. "Prejudice is a choice. Hatred is a choice. But survival is a melody. We have to show them that the only way to move forward is together. Not because we like each other, but because we're all threads in the same loom. And if they don't sing, Bran asked, then we become dust, I said. Just like the architects said, a loom that cannot hold its own threads will eventually collapse. I spent the next 12 hours in the broadcast hub, my consciousness spread across every sector of the ring. I didn't hide the truth. I showed them the Vayloni's cruisers. I showed them the glassing protocols that were already being prepared in the enemy's weapon base. I showed them the coordinates of the jump point, a place of light and peace, far beyond the reach of the convergence. This is not a command, I said, my voice echoing in 15 billion minds. This is an invitation. We have been the high and the low for too long. We have been the masters and the slaves, the ghosts and the Soot-Eaters. But today, we are just the wayfarers. If you want a future, you have to find the song in your own heart. You have to choose to be part of the pattern. The Vayloni's cruisers reached the edge of the ring. Their weapon bays opened, the massive particle cannons beginning to charge with a violent, white-hot energy. They didn't send a hail. They didn't ask for surrender. They were the architects of order, and they were here to reset the slate. Now or never, Nix, Kyle's voice crackled over the comm. The cruisers are at 300,000 kilometers. They're locking on. I closed my eyes and stood in the center of the memory core. I didn't start the song. I waited. For a long, agonizing minute, there was nothing but silence. The cold, sterile silence of the void. And then I heard it. It started in the deep damp. A low, rough hum from the faded. Then it was joined by the melodic chime of the Aeons in the gardens. Then the rhythmic grind of the obsidian in the dredge. And then, the spire. A single tentative note from a delegate who had seen the air vent. Then another, and another. 15 billion voices began to rise. It wasn't a perfect song. It was jagged, discordant, and full of the friction of 15 billion different lives. But it was one song. It was a resonance that shook the very foundations of the ring. I felt the station respond. The heart's gate didn't just open, it vanished. The entire zenith ring began to glow with a brilliant, blinding sapphire light. The jump field began to form, a massive bubble of condensed memory that wrapped around the station like a protective cocoon. "Jump drive engaged," Vance's voice shouted, barely audible over the roar of the resonance. "We're folding space. Hold on to something." Ew! The Vayloni's cruisers fired. 3 massive beams of white-hot energy tore through the void, aimed at the center of the ring. But the beams hit nothing but empty space. The zenith ring vanished. In its place was a lingering trail of sapphire starlight, a faint echo of a song that had finally found its harmony. We didn't feel the movement. There was no jolt, no acceleration. There was only a sudden, profound sense of peace. The heavy gravity of the station seemed to lift, the air turning sweet and cool. I opened my eyes and looked out the observatory viewport. We weren't in the 7 systems anymore. We weren't in the void. We were in a nebula of pure, shimmering color, pinks, golds, and violets that stretched on for light years. And in the center of the nebula were thousands of other rings. Some were large, some were small, but all were glowing with the same sapphire light. "The architect's graveyard," Vance whispered, standing beside me. "No, not a graveyard, a nursery. This is where the patterns are born." I looked at my skin. The sapphire light was steady, a soft, comforting glow that no longer felt like a burden. I looked at Kale, whose eyes were wide with wonder. I looked at Thalassa, who was weeping tears of joy. We had survived the test. We had looked into the face of prejudice and chosen mercy. We had looked into the face of destruction and chosen preservation. But as I watched the thousands of rings pulsing in the nebula, I knew that our work was just beginning. We were the newest threads in the great loom, and we had a whole new pattern to weave. "Nix," Kyle said, his voice quiet. "You okay?" "I'm fine, Kyle," I said, a tired, happy smile touching my lips. I'm finally home." I thought of my father. I thought of his scarred lungs and his broken body. I thought of how he would have looked at this place, at the light and the color and the billions of happy souls. He had spent his life in the dark, but he had kept the song alive. He had been a keeper before I ever was. Thank you, Dad, I whispered into the resonance. The transformation was painful. The cost was high. But as I listened to the 15 billion voices starting to sing a song of discovery, of friendship, of hope, I knew that every bit of soot, every scar, and every tear had been worth it. We weren't the grease in the gears anymore. We were the light in the dark. And the dark wasn't so scary anymore. The zenith ring began to drift toward the nearest nursery ring, its sapphire light blending with the golden nebula. We were no longer a station of the convergence. We were the wayfarer's ark, and the galaxy was waiting for us to show them what we could become. Kale, Vance, Bran, let's get to work, I said, my voice steady and full of purpose. We've got a lot of people to introduce to each other. As the arc moved deeper into the light, I felt a single, lingering thought from the memory core. A message from the architects, left behind for the first race that was brave enough to sing together. The loom is never finished. The pattern is always yours. I took a deep breath of the sweet, new air and began to weave. The silence that followed the jump was not the cold, dead vacuum of space. It was a living thing, a soft, velvet hum that seemed to cradle the entire zenith ring. For the first time in 5,000 years, the station was not fighting the gravity of a hostile system or the greed of a dying empire. It was floating in the architect's nursery, a cradle of pink and violet nebulae that stretched across the horizon like a sea of crushed amethysts. I stood on the observation deck of the forge, my hands pressed against the reinforced glass. The sapphire glow on my skin had settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse, no longer the frantic alarm of a dying world. Beside me, Alara Vance was staring at her data slate, her face illuminated by the golden light of the nebula. The atmospheric pressure is holding at 100% across all sectors, she whispered, her voice sounding thin and reverent in the quiet. The nutrient lines are stable. The energy pool in the core has distributed itself perfectly. We aren't just surviving, Nyx. We're thriving. It's the first time the ring has been whole since the builders left, I said. Behind us, the heavy doors of the deck hissed open. Cal walked in, looking like he'd been through a meat grinder and then hastily patched back together. His arm was in a sling, and a jagged scar ran across his jaw from the fight in the relay chamber. But his eyes were clear. The transition tiers are a real trip, Nyx, he said, leaning against a console. You've got former High Conclave delegates sharing their ration pulp with obsidian dredgers. I saw a lady in a silk gown, looked like she'd never touched a dirty tool in her life, helping a three-fingered pipe tech fix a ventilation seal. No shouting, no low-res insults, just people trying to make sure the air stays sweet. How are the flayed? I asked, the image of Jax's raw, bleeding face still haunting the edges of my mind. Better, Kale replied, his expression softening. Thalassa and her people are working overtime. They're acting as a sort of, I don't know, a harmonic bridge? The Aeons are staying close to the boys who lost their polymer. They say if they keep the resonance close, the pain doesn't bite as hard. It's like they're teaching them how to hear the song with their hearts since their skin can't do it anymore. I walked with them down to the transition tiers. The prejudice that had been the foundation of our society for 10,000 years hadn't vanished overnight, but it had been shattered. It's hard to look down on a Soot-Eater when you felt their heartbeat in your own chest during a jump through the void. We passed a makeshift medical bay where the empathetic shock victims were being treated. In the center of the room sat Magistrate Varric. He wasn't in a cell. He didn't need to be. He was sitting on a simple cot staring at his hands. When he looked up at me, there was no arrogance left in his gaze, only a hollow, terrifying awareness. I can still feel them, Nyx, he rasped. His voice was no longer oily. It was thin, like dry grass. Every time a child cries in the lower decks, I feel a pang in my lungs. Every time an old man sighs in the dark, my heart skips a beat. I spent my whole life trying to be the mind of this station. I never realized the mind was made of 15 billion broken pieces. That's the weight of the pattern, Varric, I said, standing before him. I didn't feel the urge to strike him or scream at him. He was a man who had been forced to wake up in a world where he could no longer ignore the cost of his silk robes. You didn't want to be a thread. You wanted to be the weaver. But weavers have to love the fabric, or they just end up with a mess of knots. I I want it to stop, he whispered, his eyes filling with tears. The noise, the feeling, it's too much. It won't stop, I said, and for the first time I felt a spark of the humanistic lesson I had been forced to learn. But it will get easier. Once you start trying to fix the threads you broke, instead of just mourning the fact that they're there. He didn't answer. He just looked back at his hands, his fingers twitching as if he were trying to grasp a song he could no longer control. We moved on to the flayed ward in the heart of the forge. Jax was sitting up, his raw skin now covered in fine translucent bandages provided by the Aeon healers. Thalassa sat beside him, her starlight hand resting on the back of his neck. They were silent, but the air around them was vibrating with a soft, comforting frequency. "Hey, kid," Kyle said, walking over to Jax. "How's the new skin treating you?" Jax looked up, a faint, weary smile touching his lips. "It's different, Kale. I don't hear the pumps anymore. I don't hear the heavy lifts, but I can hear her. I can hear the way she thinks about the stars. It's better than the cure. It's real. The symbiosis is a bridge of memory," Thalassa said, her voice a melody of pure light. "We are no longer Aeon and Obsidian. We are the Shadow Aeons, a new thread for a new world." I realized then that the destruction Xylos had tried to cause had been turned into a new kind of creation. The useless and the broken had found a way to become something that neither race could have been on their own. It was a testament to the fact that diversity isn't just a political buzzword. It's a biological necessity for a pattern that wants to survive. "What now, Nix?" Vance asked as we stood on the balcony overlooking the new settlement. Below us, thousands of structures were being carved out of the living rock of the forge, gardens were being planted, and a new kind of city was rising from the sapphire light. "The Veloni's cruisers won't find us here. The convergence is a million light years away. We're free. But what do we do with that freedom?" "We build the archive," I said, looking out at the thousands of other rings pulsing in the nebula. "We collect every song, every story, and every memory that the hi-hats tried to erase. We make sure that no one ever has to be just grease in a machine again. We teach the whole ring that heritage isn't a weight to shed. It's the only thing that keeps us from being ghosts." "A school for Soot-Eaters?" Kale grinned, his eyes bright. "I like the sound of that. I can teach them how to fix a gravity shear with nothing but a piece of wire and a bad attitude." "And I'll teach them the science of the resonance," Vance added. "The real science, not the sanitized version the Spire used to control us." As the suns of the nursery began to set, casting a deep golden glow over the station, I felt a sense of peace that I had never known. The conflict wasn't over. 15 billion people would always have friction. But the battle for our souls had been won. We had looked at the things we were told were worthless, and we had found the keys to our salvation. I spent the next 48 hours organizing the first meetings of the new conclave. We didn't sit in the spire. We sat in a circle on the grass of the hanging gardens. There were no silk robes, no holographic titles. There was just the keeper, the scholar, the dredger, and the envoy. "We need a name for this new era," Brand said, leaning on his copper pipe. The old fated man had become a sort of unofficial advisor to the council, his long years in the deep damp giving him a perspective that the shining ones often missed. "Something that reminds us of the dirt we came from and the light we found." "The resonant dawn," Thalassa suggested. "Too poetic," Kyle muttered. "How about the great shift?" "I think," I said, looking at the gray, soot-stained skin of my hands, "we should just call it home, because that's what we were always looking for. A place where we didn't have to change who we were just to be allowed to exist." The decision was unanimous. As the first week in the nursery came to a close, the Zenith Ring began to feel less like a station and more like a living, breathing entity. The barriers between the sectors were coming down, replaced by a constant flow of people, ideas, and songs. The prejudice that had fueled the flayed war was being replaced by a cautious, stubborn curiosity. I sat alone in the observatory on the final night of the first cycle. The memory core was pulsing softly behind me, a steady, sapphire heartbeat. I thought about the thousands of years of silence, the millions of people who had lived and died in the dark, and the simple, impossible luck that had led me to that first transmission. We had been lucky, but we had also been brave. We had chosen to listen when the whole world was telling us to stay silent. We had chosen to remember when it would have been easier to forget. And as I looked out at the infinite patterns of the nursery, I knew that our song was just beginning. One solar cycle has passed since we jumped into the architect's nursery. To some, it feels like a lifetime. To others, it feels like we only arrived yesterday. The Zenith Ring, now officially renamed the Wayfarer's Ark, has become a beacon of sapphire light in the Golden Nebula. We are no longer a drifting fragment of a Dyson ring. We are a thriving civilization of 15 billion souls, a fusion of three distinct heritages that have finally learned how to weave a single, complex pattern. I no longer work the docks of Sector 44, but I still wear my old boots. They are worn, the leather cracked and stained with the ancient grease of the dredge, but I refuse to trade them for the soft, silk slippers the new administration offered me. They are a reminder of the miles I've walked, of the grime that saved my life, and of the man who taught me how to find the song in the machine. The archive of the loom is now the heart of the station. It isn't a palace of glass and chrome. It's a tiered library carved into the very stone of the forge, where the light of the memory core illuminates thousands of scrolls, data slates, and voice crystals. It's a place where children from the spire sit beside children from the dredge, learning the song of the loom and the mathematics of the resonance. Today is the day of remembrance. It's a new holiday we've established to honor the soot that the convergence tried to wash away. Across the station, people are painting their skin with gray, non-toxic pigment, celebrating the conductor that allows us to speak to the Ark. It's a beautiful sight, a sea of gray-skinned people, high and low, all glowing with a soft, sapphire light. I stood on the podium of the Archive Plaza, looking out at the crowd. Kyle was there, his new prosthetic arm, a gift from the Aeon engineers, gleaming in the sunlight. Ilara Vance was beside him, her head buried in a new research paper about the nebula's effect on long-term resonance. Bran was sitting in the front row, his copper pipe held high like a scepter of the deep dam. I didn't give a long political speech. I didn't need to. We were told we were Greece, I said, my voice carrying through the resonance to every corner of the Ark. We were told we were ghosts. We were told that our heritage was a stain on a perfect world. But look around you. The Greece became the conductor, the ghosts became the guides, and the stain became the light that showed us the way home. I stepped down from the podium and walked into the crowd. I didn't go to the VIP section. I went to the back, to a small group of flayed men who were still struggling with the transition. Jax was there, his pearlescent skin shimmering. He reached out and took my hand, his grip firm and warm. "Thank you, Nix," he whispered, "for not letting us forget." "Thank you for remembering, Jax," I said. I spent the afternoon walking through the gardens with Thalassa. She has become my closest friend, a sister of starlight who understands the burden of leadership better than anyone. "The other rings are responding, Nix," she said, pointing to a cluster of pulsing lights in the distance. "They have heard our song. They are beginning to move toward us." The architect's nursery is becoming a convergence of its own, a convergence of peace. "It's a big pattern, Thalassa," I said. "I hope we're ready to weave it." "We have the keepers," she said, smiling. "We will be ready." As the evening approached, I retreated to my private quarters, a small, simple room overlooking the core. It was filled with mementos of my journey, my father's old hydro wrench, a piece of void glass from Thalassa's first veil, a handful of dried clover from the forge's first harvest. I sat by the window and watched the sapphire light of the station blend with the violet nebulae. For the first time in my life, the vibration in my bones was not a warning, it was a lullaby. I looked back at the girl I was a year ago, the soot-stained laborer who thought she was invisible, who thought her father's songs were just nonsense, who lived in fear of the next shift and the next quota. I barely recognized her. She had been so afraid of the very things that made her powerful. She had been so desperate to be clean that she had almost washed away her soul. I realized then that the greatest victory wasn't the jump or the defeat of the architects. It was the moment I stopped trying to be someone else. It was the moment I accepted the gray skin and the rough voice and the heavy boots. I am Nyx Thala. I am an obsidian. I am a keeper. And I am exactly who I was always meant to be. The journey had been long, painful, and filled with 1,000 ways to fail. But we had found the one way to win. We had found it in the things that the world had thrown away. As I closed my eyes to rest, I felt the station hum beneath me. 15 billion voices, all breathing in rhythm, all part of a pattern that would never be finished. We were the wayfarers, and we were finally, truly home. I spent 32 years of my life trying to be invisible. In the dredge, invisibility was survival. If the overseers didn't see you, they couldn't dock your credits or send you into a pressurized leak without a suit. I used to think the gray on my skin was a shadow I could never escape, a mark of the soot that would eventually claim my lungs just like it claimed my father's. I hated the lullabies, the nonsense words, and the way the hi-hats in the spire would look through me like I was made of glass. I thought being somebody meant being clean. I thought it meant having a name that didn't smell like oil and recycled air. But standing here now, looking at the sapphire starlight reflecting off my own hands, I realize how wrong I was. The very things I tried to hide were the only things that were real. My father's songs weren't just melodies. They were the blueprints of a miracle. The soot wasn't a stain. It was the bridge that allowed me to hear the heartbeat of the universe. I spent so long looking up at the spire, wishing for their silk and their logic, never realizing that the foundation was the only part of the building that truly mattered. I've learned that humanity, or whatever you want to call this mess of souls we've gathered, isn't found in the things we build to look important. It's found in the things we keep when everything else is stripped away. It's in the songs we sing when we're afraid, the stories we tell our children in the dark, and the stubborn, beautiful refusal to forget where we came from. I am not a hero, and I am not a queen. I am just a girl who remembered that being poor doesn't mean being powerless, and that sometimes the most precious things in the galaxy are the ones currently covered in dust. I spent my whole life thinking my heritage was a weight I had to shed to move forward, only to find out it was the only thing that could save us. We all have those parts of ourselves we try to wash away, the soot of our past, the low-res memories we're ashamed of, or the traditions that don't seem to fit in a modern world. I wonder, what is that one thing you've been trying to hide because you think it makes you less? What would happen if you stopped trying to be clean and realized that your scars are actually the conductors for your greatest strength? The sapphire light of the station pulsed one last time, a slow and steady heartbeat that echoed through the nebula. I picked up my father's old wrench, feeling the familiar, heavy weight of the iron in my hand, and stepped out into the new dawn to start the morning shift. There was a whole universe to weave, and I wasn't about to miss a single thread.